Hi, everybody. My name is Natalie Yeadon, and I'm one of the CEOs for Impetus Digital. At Impetus Digital, we have built some of the best-in-class asynchronous and synchronous virtual collaboration and communication tools for the life science companies. We've helped companies with everything from virtual advisory boards, focus groups, medical education. We've helped people revamp their clinical trial protocols, working with groups on rolling out their brand plans and everything in between. But more importantly, what we really believe at Impetus is that everything starts with a conversation. And from these big, hairy, audacious conversations with the provocateurs, with the leading edge thinkers, with people who are working on bleeding edge technologies, we can all work collectively to positively disrupt healthcare. And so I'm really pleased to have one of these provocateurs at the virtual table with me today. And this is Durhane Wong-Rieger. And she is the president and CEO of the Canadian Organization for Rare Disorders. We're going to call this CORD for short in this conversation. So if you hear me referring to CORD, that's what it is the Organization for Rare Disorders in Canada. She's also the chair of the International Organization of Rare Disorders. In addition, she's the president. So if that's not all, folks, she's also the president for the Institute for Optimizing Health Outcomes and is working with the World Health Organization. So if you thought you were working on the weekend, we can only imagine what Durhane has been doing as well. So she has served on numerous health policy advisory committees and panels, such as the Advisory Board for the Canadian Institutes of Health Research Institute of Genetics, the Patient Liaison Forum for the Canadian Drugs and Technologies in Health, the International Alliance of Patient Organizations, and the DIA International Association. So this is a whirlwind. We're going to want to get into all of it today. Durhane has a PhD in psychology from McGill University. So welcome, Durhane. It is such a pleasure to see you. You've been a long-standing member in the healthcare space for years and years. All of us know and adore you. So welcome. We're happy to have you on the show.
Well, thank you so much, number one, for that wonderful introduction. I feel like I ought to just turn off my camera and go away and leave that as a last impression. So given all that, but yeah, absolutely. And certainly, I think what you folks are doing has now become the core, the center of everything that we're doing. So kudos in terms of all the resources and support that you're bringing to all of us.
Love it, love it. You have been a centerpiece in patient advocacy and work around all sorts of things around access and fairness and everything that you can imagine over years and years. And I think many of us know you, but for the minority who do not, we'd love to kind of get a little bit of an understanding, in as short a brief explanation as you can about how you started and how you ended up in this really interesting place in rare disorders. So tell us a little bit about your career trajectory.
So interestingly enough, I've kind of ended up where I actually started. I actually have 2 children, both born with rare conditions, but that isn't how I got into advocacy work. I mean, I was a professor at university. I taught for about almost 20 years. But I was always involved in community work. I got involved and then requested by the Canadian Hemophilia Society late 80s, 90s, when all the issues around tainted blood were going on. And the community was really being torn by the fact that, many members of their community had become infected, were dying of HIV, but nobody wanted to acknowledge it. There was absolutely no support for the community, especially since they'd gone through a period of time in which they had no access to treatments. Most of the treatments were in hospital, and now they had portable treatments that, young men were able to raise families, have normal working careers, and all of a sudden, boom, they get hit with HIV, and the community and the government and the pharma industry turns their backs on and says, it's not my fault. So I got involved to try to help raise awareness around this condition, bring understanding in terms of what happened, but as importantly, bringing in the next generation of new therapies that were not at all based in blood, but could actually be brought in safely. So that became my volunteer work around healthcare and advocacy. And when I got done with that, which actually turned out to be something like a 7-year volunteer stint, I decided I really wanted to do this full time. So left the university career, went into advocacy with no job and no prospects, started a small not-for-profit Institute for Optimizing Health Outcomes, and then got drawn back into rare diseases in trying to help draft an orphan drug policy, because we were the only developed country in the world that did not have some special policy for rare diseases, orphan drugs. And having two children who have been affected, I felt that this was something that I could lend some attention to. And as I said, after about 6 years as a volunteer lead for that organization, made it into my full-time work. And this is kind of where I've ended up now. But more and more in Canada, we realized in order for us to be effective, we had to work globally. So we joined all of the international communities. We began to work in collaboration, especially with the Europeans, who had very similar kinds of healthcare systems to us. But also what we realized in rare diseases, because each one of these diseases is so small, we had to work across the globe in order to make an impact. And that led us then to some of the work with the UN, with the WHO, with other global commissions. And I think it have helped to raise, I think, global diseases to the kind of attention, support that is available now. And of course, the huge developments in the pharmaceutical products have really lended a great deal. Scientific knowledge has lended a great deal. So kind of things coming together, I think, for us at this time.
So Durhane, so I just kind of want to backtrack a little bit around this whole new world that has suddenly blossomed, although it's not anything new, although there's an increased focus on rare diseases. The typical pharma model of 20, 30, 40 years ago was on this blockbuster concept. And I think we have quickly accelerated to a place where we realize that all of these blockbuster health conditions are no longer available for blockbuster drugs and pills and chemicals. Everything that has basically needed to be found or discovered has been discovered. And so the path, if you will, to financialization of these products and the revenues and the increasing value to shareholders, the outlook started to become diminished. Hence, potentially, some people may view this as people looking for these super niche products and opportunities to consider to develop the revenue models for these pharmaceutical companies. Can you speak a little bit around the potential view on that, maybe from the average person who may not be looking at the pharmaceutical industry as favorably? Is this is just another outlet for them to be financializing, I guess, what they're doing?
So I think in a really fair way of putting it, if one is looking at it from the point of view of drug development, I'll take you back to where the patient view is and where the science view is. None of this would be possible if science hadn't done what it did. And that is the way back to the beginnings in the 80s, and when we mapped out the human genome, recognizing that many diseases have a genetic cause. 80% of rare diseases are genetic, but many common diseases are actually genetic. And what we have learned over the years is that, in fact, diabetes is not diabetes, cardiovascular disease is not cardiovascular disease. All of these are, even cancers, right? They are all subtypes. Within them, there are subtypes, and many of those are genetically, genomically, defined. I mean, obviously, environmental factors have a huge part of it. So when you say the blockbuster drugs, remembering that the blockbuster drugs only work for about 50, 60, 70% of the people that were taking those medicines. The other people were kind of thrown in there, and we never really knew whether it worked for them. And we didn't know because we just assumed they were all alike. We treated them all alike, and they were not all alike. So what rare diseases, what we learned from the very beginning is that, of course, they are very different. There's 7,000 rare diseases. And yes, they could be grouped into bigger clusters of diseases. But in fact, we started off with the assumption that each one of these diseases affected a small number of people. And the goal at the beginning was to figure out what was the genetic cause of that disease. Because if I can figure out where the gene is that causes that disease, why then that disease looks the way it does, can I fix that? Can we actually, either change the course of that disease or even in, as we're doing now, quote, curing that disease. And, and absolutely. Now, in the beginning, as you say, there was no revenue model for it. Numbers were too small, cost too much to do the development. And we talk about orphan drugs. You hear the word orphan drugs, and they really do refer to the fact that many of these drugs, when they were in early development, were actually companies would discover them, put them back on the shelf. There's a fascinating story around how the Orphan Drug Act in the US came to be. In 1973, there was a mom who had a kid who had Tourette syndrome. One day, the big pharma company, who was researching the drug that her son was on, said, "We're pulling the drug. It's not working." Well, what the company meant was that we were using the drug to research a big common condition, wasn't working in that condition. So they were stopping the trials altogether. She says, "But it's working for my kid. It's working for our group." And they said, "Yeah, you're too small. Even if we were to develop the drug successfully, we would never be able to make any money for it. So we're shutting it all down." And that was the impetus to getting then the Orphan Drug Act. So, Congress had been pushing it around for a long time in the US. How do we get, how do we provide incentives for companies to develop these drugs? So about 1983, when all this came together, finally the Orphan Drug Act gets passed through a lot of advocacy work on the behalf of the parents. Fascinating story in terms of how Jack Klugman, an actor, got involved in all of this. But that was the beginning. And certainly in the beginning, a lot of these drugs were not profitable. They took a long time to research, very small patient populations. And it was only much later that they actually became what they are and where they are now, where we've got, in the beginning, before the Orphan Drug Act, 10 new drugs for rare diseases in that whole decade. Today, we have close to 700 new drugs for rare diseases.
So this is really interesting, Durhane, because really what I'm hearing you say very eloquently is rare diseases in some ways is almost like the manifestation of precision medicine. So we've basically taken these big conglomerate condition types as these big kind of bulgy things, and we broke them down into these subset situations, conditions, diseases, which were really part of this bigger thing called cardiovascular, this bigger thing called respiratory, this bigger thing called multiple sclerosis or neurological situations, broke them up and then branded them with a inclusion of some sort of a genetic code, which now gives it a label.
Yes.
So with that understanding, so this is a really interesting concept. So we've now super niched this. We created an opportunity where people can find something that's going to be uber focused, and although the numbers are smaller, the ability to have a higher response rate or efficacy rate goes up because it's now uber specialized. If we can match the genetic coding for this brand or this product with your genetic coding, that makes sense. Can you speak to it, a little bit around that concept or that rethinking of that? And also the concern that we have on the original concept of misdiagnosis when we started working with these big, hulking, gigantic, bulgy conditions in the first place.
Well, no, you've got it perfectly. And there's where the risk is as well as the potential, right? I mean, it's sort of like media. You think about big public media, we broadcast from the TV station, we get out to tens of millions of people, and we got a message. And then you think about social media and you think what you're doing in terms of niching that message, right? You know intimately that, if I can target the message to you personally, I'm going to get a response. Whereas if I broadcast it out, sure, I can get it to a lot of people and I will get an overall response, but I'm going to be missing a whole lot of people and probably ticking off a whole bunch of others. So this is the same parallel. What's happening is that, to be honest with you, I would imagine if there had not been rare diseases, if we had not been doing the work that we're doing in terms of trying to unpack the code for these diseases, finding diagnoses for them, being able to treat them, we would have no precision medicine because it's all from the same concept. That's the challenge we've got. Why do we not have a treatment for Parkinson's disease? Because Parkinson's disease is not Parkinson's disease. It's made up of probably 60, 70 diseases, and we haven't unpacked it. If we were to treat all cancers as if it were the same cancer, what are we going to do? Radiate your entire body? That's the equivalent of what we're doing when we say, here, just take this statin. It'll work for you because it works for everybody. Not the case, right? So we know that isn't. So yes, what we're learning to do is to actually be able to subdivide that condition into many, many subtypes. And if I can figure out what that genetic code is for you and figure out what that gene that is malfunctioning is doing, I can come a lot closer to finding the right treatment, or maybe even to fixing that gene so that you don't have that condition. But if I assume that all of you that have the same manifestations are all driven by the same cause, we're not going to ever get there. I mean, I would say we could not do what we're doing today with the vaccine for COVID-19 if it had not been for rare diseases. I chuckle when I hear the TV says, you know, the Pfizer vaccine is going to be the first commercially available messenger RNA. Not true. We've got messenger RNA for rare disease. So we're doing that already. And that's where the technology has been developed and perfected. And now we're turning around and saying, oh, how can we apply it to some of these broader conditions? So it really is an amazing, you know, integrated kind of a system that we've got. The concern, of course, is that, you know, we will now have to do a whole lot different in terms of how do we diagnose. We cannot go in and just get a diagnosis for cardiovascular disease and say, oh, you have arrhythmia. No, we have to understand. You don't just have, you know, high cholesterol. What type? What's the cause of it? Is it genetic? I think those are the kind of things that are going to really profoundly change the way in which we treat people. But as you might imagine, the impact on the healthcare system, the impact in terms of health budgets can be tremendous unless we think about it and do something quite differently. That's where I think the value is going to be. We have to rethink how we're financing health and how we're investing in health.
We're going to definitely talk on that. And that probably requires multiple sessions, like I'm sure you're running on your YouTube channel. So I want to just talk a few minutes around the piece on the diagnosis and, you know, what we're doing in this space. Specifically, when we're talking about the one size fits all and trying to categorize this, is that we're suddenly getting into a place where we have to understand things at a deeper level. We need to understand things at a genetic level. And at a genetic level, we need to find the right ways of studying that through things like biomarkers and digital therapeutics and digital biomarkers and digital avatars and all these other things. So digital set aside, we need to get into the nitty-gritty around genetics. We don't have an application in Canada, or I think really elsewhere in the world, with specific parameters around how we do genetics, genetic counseling. We make this sort of a mainstay or something that's actually done at inception, just like getting a driver's license or a social insurance number, or, you know, registering when somebody is being born. Being able to have that kind of code so that not only that individual, but also populations based on these codes can start to be put into data lakes and analyzed for the greater good or for an altruistic standpoint. So I know there's a lot packed into my question, but it comes down to the issue around specificity and having the right tools and data sets in order to be able to do the things that you're suggesting. How do we do that? And really, what is your association trying to do around genetics?
The tools, fascinatingly enough, are already available. We have moved rapidly in terms of being able to do what they call genomic sequencing. We can now rapidly, you know, sequence your entire genome if you want, and from that be able to analyze where are the so-called defects, where are the deviations, and then what does those defects or deviations mean? I mean, not that we want to, but we could. We are doing it in very sophisticated ways. In Canada, we've set up these pilot genome sequencing centers where, you know, individuals who are identified as potentially at risk for something can be referred and have their genome not necessarily entirely sequenced, but sequenced in those areas where we believe the defect may be. So you have to take a lot of information and focus it in order to make it really effective, right? So we can do that already. The challenge is, and it's getting cheaper. You know, as we used to say, something that costs $1 million, begin to cost $100,000, costs $10,000. We can get it down to probably under $1,000 now, which is still a lot of money, but, you know, certainly a lot different then. And what used to take, you know, 2 or 3 years and then took down to several months can now be done in a very short period of time. So I think we can do it. It's getting the health systems around it in order to do it, and getting the value proposition set up in such a way that we can say, okay, invest that money up front, because the payoff is going to be huge coming down the road. I mean, these are all the things, and all in Canada as well. We have a lot of pilots, we have a lot of initiatives set up. We've got companies that are poised to do it, both publicly and privately. It's trying to bring it all together. I belong to a network that's called Beat Cancer, which is looking at how do we get that kind of precision genomic sequencing for certain types of cancers, and then being able to diagnose it, and then trying to find the right treatments. In the US, you go to any of the major cancer centers, they will ask you already, do you want an individual diagnosis? Can we do that for you? And that is possible. I mean, so again, it's trying to make it much more available, trying to make it more mainstream, trying to be able to use that information. We can do it today, and we will be able to do it better and better, obviously, as we begin to have more, entities that are involved in it, and we begin to see the value of it. So we really are trying to make that pivot. It's so hard getting around that corner right now. And I think that's
really, yeah. And it's interesting because one of the things that blows your mind is I have never seen the immensity of the average layperson being so focused and so educated on what's going on in the healthcare space since the COVID-19 pandemic. We're getting regular news media talking about efficacy rates. We're getting views on mechanisms of action. And suddenly everybody's got a secondary medical degree now. So so with all kidding aside, it's actually mind-boggling to see this. Having said all of that, even with all of this groundswell of momentum and accelerated change and interest, you're still having issues with being able to do genetic testing to determine who of the population and what's their demographics and what's their genetics to see who has a higher propensity for the infection or not. And then taking that data and putting them into data lakes, and then being able to do precision isolation or whatever tactics are associated. There's all kinds of issues around the COVID-19 tracing app and privacy and security and what should you know and what you shouldn't know. So with all of the scrutiny and this worldwide pandemic, you can't have more people behind one single point of interest than this. And we still can't seem to get the population, to get the infrastructure, to get the dynamics and the people around the simple fact that we need the data. How do you speak to that we can't get that right for COVID-19? How is that, how can that affect what you're doing, or should it be used to leverage the momentum behind what you're trying to do with rare diseases and cancer?
Well, thank you. You've given me sort of an opening for talking about something that's very exciting for us right now. And it was before COVID, and yet we're plowing through with it in COVID in terms of rare diseases. So it's exactly what we're saying. Part of your, it's a big question, right? But it's again that old notion of how do you eat an elephant? It's like one bite at a time. Shrink it down to what we can do. With the pandemic, we can't shrink it. It's there, it's all around us. We have to deal with the whole big, enormous issue, right? But if we were in other areas, let's shrink it down. Whether we talk about cancer. Right now, in fact, on December 16th, we're going to be launching our consultation towards something that the federal government promised to us in February 2019, their budget. And that is $1 billion to set up Canada's rare disease drug strategy. This will be a program that will look at how do we bring in medicines for rare diseases and make them available to people. Now, it's more than just, okay, can I get the drugs in? It has to do with getting a diagnosis and the right diagnosis. Otherwise, it doesn't work. It has to do with supporting centers of excellence. So we've got clinicians, especially many of these therapies, gene therapies, very complex therapies require expertise in order to be able to even provide them. How do we actually have the support communities around them and the post-market, surveillance? I mean, it goes back to some of your digitals. How do we get people to be able to have ways in which they can monitor the outcomes of these treatments, that they don't have to be actively engaged in all the time? All these things come together. So what the government said is that we're having huge issues in making these, in many cases, very expensive therapies available to Canadians. And we're not real sure that we're getting the value out of them. Are they going to the right people? Are they actually having the impact that they want? Put together a standalone drug program that will be for rare diseases without defining too sharply yet what is a rare disease or not, because as we were talking about, many of these cancers are going to be rare diseases. Many of these cardiovascular diseases are going to be rare diseases. And so they are actually going to need to benefit from this same kind of a strategy. Get the diagnosis right, get to the right specialist, train up the specialists, and even invest in the research so that we can develop some of these therapies ourselves, and then make sure they're available to the right people, monitor, manage them, because even with all that testing, we will not necessarily get it right. Not everybody's going to benefit, and not everybody's going to have the level of benefit that we anticipate. So how do we make sure that we're monitoring that and either improving what we're doing or maybe moving people to something else? All of that is part and parcel of what we're trying to do in setting up this, what we're calling a pan-Canadian rare drug program. And this could, for me, would be the proof of concept. I mean, it would be the proof in terms of how precision medicine could work, because we want to be able to make sure that we're taking the best advantage of all those things that we're talking about, right? And this will be, we're going to hold the government, to their commitment. They said $1 billion over 2 years, 2022, 2023, to set up this agency. We're going to take a whole year starting now into October of next year to try to do the consultations, work with the governments at the federal and provincial levels to try to develop and define what does this agency need to look like, so that we can get to 2022 and say, okay, let's get that investment going. And if we can make this work, we would actually be the very first country in the world to actually take this approach to rare disease drugs. And as I say, what we can do here is exactly what we would need to do for other precision medicines. And quite frankly, I think as we're rolling it through, we will see that many of these, precision drugs for diseases like cancer are actually going to fit into it as well. So it's not like saying I got $1 billion and we don't want to spend it on too many people because we're going to run out. It isn't that. It's creating a program, it's creating a concept, it's creating infrastructure, creating what you already said, the data collection. We got to be able to get the data up front as the patients are being identified. We got to get the data around their health outcomes that are connected with their health records. And we got to get data so that they can be monitored in real life, where we're hoping actually some of the personal digital devices can come in so that people can actually collect their own information, and sometimes passively collect that information, like the diabetes monitors and the heart monitors, be able to relay that information back where it can be collated and it can actually be analyzed. All of that is going to be the way in which we've got a system that actually works. So it brings a lot of pieces together that we're hoping, will be more than just a proof of concept. I mean, even with this in mind, we're thinking that it's going to have to be piloted out. We'll start with specific diseases. We'll start with specific therapies, and we will try to make it so that we can have a pathway that and models that actually work.
So this is very exciting news. And obviously this is going to go toe in toe with the whole, pan-Canadian rare drug program, the Canada's rare disease drug strategy, and kind of all entangled into one formulated entity that you're going to take 1 to 2 years to create, and then start hopefully being able to cater to specific diseases one step at a time. And so that's obviously the vision, and is a very exciting thing to see. You're going to be launching on December 16th. So next week. So I guess there's going to be several key challenges associated with the task force and core components of what you're going to be trying to work through. One of the key ingredients has to do with this pan-Canada. Some people love the idea, some people are dismayed by it, because it's that whole, the whole issue between what is under the provincial jurisdictions and what's federal, and where does drug money come from. It certainly comes under the shadow of the whole, national pharma care. And, people love it, hate it. It's still that idea of pan-Canada. What does that look like and how does that get legislated? You're either in or you're out. Can you speak a little bit around this nationalization and what you sort of see the distangling, if you will, of provincial versus federal jurisdiction on an overarching budget for these particular types of drugs and diseases?
You notice we have very carefully avoided the word national. Pan-Canadian suggests that we're not creating a top-down entity that is going to hold and host everything, right? Pan-Canadian still suggests that we can have different components of it. And provinces may have their own parts of it that they will be able to bring into the mix. So we respect the fact that there are provincial jurisdictions. We're not even saying, is it all going to be under one public drug fund, or is there private drug funding still there? It can work either way. What we do know is that all of it has to be pooled. It has to be administrated together. It has to be joint governance and ownership with it. So whether that joint governance and ownership comes from, okay, I will appoint you as the head and I will, delegate you to be in charge, or we will have a pan-Canadian board and body that will actually manage it, it can work either way, right? So we've got, for instance, already CADA, the Canadian Agency for Drugs, Technology and Health. It's a standalone entity. It has provincial funding. It has federal funding. It stands alone. So I think, there are models that we have that are already working in this way. And hopefully, we will get the buy-in, because if we're talking about being able to provide equitable access across the country, and with the rare diseases. If I only have a portion of the rare disease population, I'm not going to learn a whole lot, right? So I've got to make sure that everybody's participating. Part of the $1 billion really will be to help offset infrastructure, will be to offset startup funds, will be to offset risk sharing, so that we can start patients on therapies and we can get, the data collected and then be able to decide whether or not there's an ongoing, basis for that. So hopefully what that will do is to sweeten the pot a bit, come into it, right? Because if you can come into it, then you will have the support for it. One of the other things we're trying to do is build it up from the bottom up, get the grassroots involved, get the patients involved, get the clinicians and researchers involved. If there's a groundswell of support and vision for what this could look like, then I think there could be a tremendous amount of buy-in. I mean, if the feds came in and said, here, we're going to do this, and this is how it's going to work, never going to happen, right? I mean, one of the things we can see with InfoWave, it kind of fell apart because I think there wasn't the buy-in from the bottom up, and it wasn't a building on the systems that were already there. And I think this is what we want to be able to do. I mean, is it national pharmacare? We're avoiding that topic, National pharmacare has already picked up a whole bunch, a whole lot of, kind of nuances around it. In some respects, it is, something that hopefully will be one drug entity, will be one program, and it will, in fact, be something that, all the jurisdictions and different stakeholders will want to contribute to, because they can see that there's an added value to making sure that we're working in this integrated fashion. I mean, that's why we're spending the year. Let's do the consultation. Let's hear what the views are. Let's look at where the concerns are. Can we build towards something that, at the end of the day, would be able to work on behalf of getting these therapies to people?
So Durhane, this is obviously a very exciting opportunity for patients in general who have rare diseases and these really scary conditions that a lot of times they don't even know they have. So really important work. Tell us a little bit about what you believe to be the relationship between this pan-Canadian rare disorders entity, whatever that's eventually going to be called, or drug program. And how will it relate to the other entities that already exist in the system, specifically PMPRB? How is it going to be interrelated or correlated with CADIF? And so these other entities that already exist, provincial agencies and potentially even private payers. Can you tell us about where the intersection points are? Do they still exist? Is this a standalone? Is this the correlate of CADIF, but really for, rare disorders? Paint us sort of a visual picture of what the intersection or non-intersection points are.
To be honest with you, I'm hoping that will be a lot clearer after our consultation. One of the things we will do in this consultation is actually look at a variety of models. What could the model be? Is it a single national, public entity? Is it a combination of many programs brought together and kind of knitted together? Is it something that's going to be integrated but have a lot of tie-ins to the existing agencies? I mean, that's what we want to be able to do, and we won't have an answer even then. Spend a year, let's consult on it. Let's look at how it might work. I mean, an easy starting point would be to go back to the regulators. Obviously, the regulators will still be the regulators. We need Health Canada to be able to evaluate clinical trials and the risk benefits. Obviously, there needs to be some kind of a pricing mechanism that will be able to say, how does this fit in with what international pricing is? But it may not be able to do it in the same way for the rare diseases that it might for the more common diseases. Because easy example would be, we're not going to know what the value of a therapy is until it's been in use for about several years. If it comes in, especially when it's coming in with small populations, short clinical trials, not a whole lot of understanding about the natural history of it, it may take 4, 5, 6, 10 years for us to be able to say what's the real value of it. So we've got to make that therapy available over the period of time. So it would be premature to say right at the beginning, I think it's worth this, and this is all it's ever going to be worth. So I think those are the kind of things that we would want to be able to work with existing entities. The same with CADF. They're doing right now the health technology assessment. I will say we are one of the only countries in the world that does not have a separate pathway for looking at rare disease drugs in terms of that kind of value assessment. We have asked numerous times. We've been told over and over again, we can look at it with flexibility, but we do not think a separate pathway is necessary. So this is a big challenge for us. So yes, we do need to have some modifications to how those value assessments are done. Do we think that we need to set up a whole new group of value assessors in order to do that? Or can we work with the existing value assessments between INES and CADF? The answer is I don't know. And I think that's kind of where a lot of the discussions would take place, because some of these drugs are not going to be clearly just rare disease drugs. Some of the drugs that are used for common diseases are also used for rare diseases. Some of the rare disease drugs are actually getting expanded into other therapeutic areas. So it goes back and forth. So I think we need to be able to have that kind of, open kind of integration. I do think, though, that there needs to be a lot that will be managed within one agency. And there's, again, that easy example. If I've got a therapy that actually comes in, could be a life-saving therapy, small clinical trials, I want to get it into, we have children who, spinal muscular atrophy is an easy one. Children who, if I don't get them the drug right away, they will have disease progression. The earlier I can get it into them, the more likely they're going to be able to do well, and then with ongoing treatment, they will be treated on the basis of being, not having lost muscle functions if I wait 2 years. So I've got to have, the ability to start the patients on a therapy, not necessarily with a whole lot of evidence in terms of whether it works or not. And then I need to be able to monitor them. I need to be able to provide that feedback into the system. And and it would make no sense which is what we're doing right now. We bring them in, we give the patients the drugs for a short period of time. We decided, okay, it could work for a bigger patient population that has that disorder that wasn't part of the original clinical trials. I have to now make a new application back into Health Canada, make a new application back into CADF. They spend another year and a half to assess it. By that time, my child has moved on. I need to be able to do that within one stream. I need the clinicians to be able to do that intimately, collect that information, and we do a rapid reassessment. Those are the kind of things that actually make a whole lot of sense to us, that we've got to have it integrated, right? So yes, there needs to be points of contact, but there are also things that need to be managed within. It's like going into a clinic, right? And you need to be able to have specialists that you can refer the child to, but you still need to have somebody who's in charge of that whole clinical, journey, right? Who's going to be the master person and who can, when necessary, make those quick decisions to say, no, I need to do it this way, and we need to change, the course of treatment based on what we're seeing, without having to say, okay, let me wait another 6 months until the eye doctor can come in, or the ear specialist, or the liver specialist come in. I can't wait that long.
Yeah, absolutely. It's sort of like dealing with a general contractor as opposed to the skilled trades, and having to actually build your own house and things kind of falling apart, not really knowing, for those of us who've ever had to do renovations with a home. So I just want to spend a couple of minutes just talking around the delivery and the development. It's one thing about discovering new products, right? We realize that clinical trials are absolutely pivotal in terms of drug discovery. We've heard all kinds of things happening since COVID, changing the way people are doing this. Patient-reported outcomes, e-consents, all kinds of things have rapidly been accelerated and optimized. But in this discourse is also the question around payment schedules. How are these drugs getting reimbursed? How are patients getting access to these? And the overarching question, of course, is that these companies who are discovering these rare diseases to get reimbursed for all of the hard work, research, years and years of getting approvals and whatnot, have to be able to make up the money. And so hence these products are doubly expensive because the cash pool is smaller. So it's, it's that whole dialogue. Now, with all of that said, we're talking a lot more about future models of risk sharing, being able to assess products by the outcomes that they're actually creating in the real world. We're talking about real world data. And again, the ability to do wearables, sensors, electronic mechanisms, ambient biometrics, et cetera, to be able to do this and assess this over time. All of these are ultimately coming into these data lakes, and we're always having these discussions about what are we doing with this data? How are we refining it? How are we ensuring that physicians and allied healthcare providers are not just fancy data scientists, but can handle with the information at an appropriate level? My question really comes down to is, what is the future of patients as it relates to this centralization of drug discovery, of creating real world data, and then being able to use this information to further refine the reimbursement schedules and eventually the prices of these products, because they can actually come in and either do really, really well or fail quickly, and then people can just move on and get on to the next one. What is your sense around the future of all of that?
Everything that you said. You actually put it quite eloquently yourself there. So, I mean, obviously we need to change our financing models. We need to be able to set it up in such a way that we can think of it more as an investment rather than as a cost center. We're not paying for something, we're investing in something. That means that, it may change over time. The value proposition will change over time, and we need to be able to adjust in terms of our ability to finance something over time. And one of the, in many jurisdictions right now, if we're thinking about gene cell therapies, durable therapies, there's already an amortization model. Pay up front, pay for performance. Every year that the patient continues to demonstrate the kinds of outcomes that we agreed on, I will give you another payment. If not, then we will stop payments, do something else, right? So I think that's something that we're going to have to do more and more of, and we can do that. We need to have, and this is where I hope this $1 billion makes sense. We need to have a pool of monies up front, though, that we can invest into it, right? That risk sharing scheme means that, okay, I've got to have some monies that I can put into it. I need you, company, to actually accept some of that risk, though. Your reward for bringing it in early is that you will assume some of that risk. Some of our risk sharing models say, if the patient doesn't actually benefit, right? We take a guess, this patient will benefit. Doesn't, you pay the upfront cost. If the patient doesn't actually benefit, we will take the patient off therapy. We will pay you nothing or a little amount, right? So there's a risk sharing in that proposition. The other thing that can happen is we can try to be a little bit more, I think, I don't know, omniscient in terms of what we think the outcomes might be. Is there a potential that the therapy might work? What am I willing to risk in terms of bringing a person into it? And that means I've got to have a pool of funds that I'm willing to risk into that, right? So if I'm a cash-strapped drug plan, public or private, I may not have it. But if we've got it into another pool somewhere, we can start that patient. If the patient benefits from it, then you will take over the payments, right? So I've got that upfront kind of, funding to do it, and as well as asking the drug companies. The other thing we would like to do is to write the guidelines for access in a way that would also allow for a greater pool of patients to actually participate. Right now, the way our system works is that it's very risk aversive. It's a risk benefits aversive at the regulatory end, but it's a risk cost aversive at the reimbursement end. We need to open that up more. And in order to do that, so I can go back now to, companies, I would say honestly, make their pricing based on the fact that I'm going to get only a small portion of the eligible patient population reimbursed, right? We know that. We're going to have to fight to get it because drug plans are saying we can't afford it. What if I gave you 90% of the population? What if we said, okay, we think at the end of the day, based on our best guess, this is the population that would benefit. What do you want to charge me now? The other thing that we need to be doing in Canada, and this is why we're trying to work globally, we need global access strategies. What if I gave you the world? What do you want to charge now? What if we help open it up so that we're going to be making these drugs more immediately available around the world, where we're investing in clinics, we invest in diagnosis, and we have this huge pool. I mean, they're tiny in Canada. I may have 2,000 in Canada, but around the world, I may have 20,000. I may have 200,000. What do we want to do then? Let's think in ways that are quite different. It's like, again, this vaccine. What do we need to do in order to develop it? And where are the pool of patients? Well, guess what? They're global. So we need, and most of these countries are global. So what can Canada help lead the way to do that? I would love
Yeah,
to see.
and Durhane, this is actually a very interesting conversation because on the one hand, it sounds incredibly exciting. And why would we not want to go and incorporate globalization? But on the other hand, you actually brought up something really important, which is we're very risk averse. There's still a lot of entities in Canada and elsewhere that still requires ink signatures, even though we're in this world of e-consent and digital signatures and on and on.
No, it's
Very
faxes.
risk averse,
We're
right?
just getting away from faxes, for gosh sakes.
Fax machines, absolutely. There's one in every doctor's office, hopefully not everyone. Now we're in this place where we're kind of in this conflict where globalization versus regionalization, and this real fear of losing what we have, and that includes jobs, that includes infrastructure, that includes everything that we built today. Suddenly, it makes one ask the question: if we're suddenly going to open this up to 200, 2,000, 20,000 people globally, what does that mean to the Canadian entity or the Canadian affiliate? Or to the one in Austria or Belgium, or do we suddenly just have one global entity that's kind of managing all this, and the company just makes their funds through that? Like, what does that look like, and how do you operationalize that or deal with the intrinsic concerns of globalization?
Two things, right? I think you said it's very important. One is, no, we do not assume that there will be just one global entity, because that would not serve local needs, and it would not serve, national needs of different countries. It would not also serve local needs, even beyond, below, right, the national level. I mean, we do have a strong system in provinces, and I believe very much in terms of provinces, because they are quite different in terms of the population and the outlook, et cetera. My son lives in Alberta, and he's become a different person since he's moved to Alberta. God bless him. So it's fine. We get it. But I think that is something that we want to preserve, and we want to make sure. But and this is where the psychology comes in. I'm not taking anything away from you. I'm giving you more. I'm giving you more power. I'm giving you more control. So we're not going to take away, I think, anything, any more than we say to a clinician: I'm taking away your right to make the individual choice. I'm going to give you more tools. I'm going to give you more options so you could actually help make the better choice. I'm not taking away the data from your patients. I'm going to allow you to actually be able to pull that data and return back to you richer information, so you know where your patient is relative to this growing data pool. So I'm giving you more back, right? So we set up the system in such a way that people are going to be enriched by it, not that they're going to be impoverished by it. So how could you not want to do that? The other thing that's very exciting, I do say, Natalie, is that I'm hoping that what the feds have said is something that we will follow through on, and Canada can be a global leader. We can be a leader in this. I mean, think about it. We're not the US, so we're not mired down in that, all the god awful stuff that's happening there. We're not Europe, where in fact they also have a huge lot of problems in terms of competing jurisdictions, right? So I think we can actually set up a model, and I think we can actually take some leadership in that. It's kind of a interesting story, is that the centers of expertise in Europe, the rare disease centers of excellence that are in Europe, are actually been set up by our own Health Canada, the Canadian, what are they called? The healthcare, it used to be called the accreditation body. Their health, God, I can't think of their name now. I'm really sorry. But they're the one, and the Europeans, I don't know if it was true or not. The story I heard was that when they were setting up these international centers of excellence, so that the idea was that all 26 European countries would actually invest in centers for rare diseases that were located in different countries, different specialties. When they were setting them up and accrediting them, they all kind of looked at each other and said, we don't want any one of our countries to be the ones that are going to be able to drive that. So they turned to Canada. I said, well, let's ask the Canadians. They have great expertise, they have great knowledge, but they're not going to be conflicted in the same way that we are. In some respects, I think we can help play that kind of a role as well, provide the models, serve as that kind of guidance. Not that we're going to be in charge of anything, but I think we can help pave the way in many of these kinds of aspects. I mean, the same as we play, that's why we are involved with the WHO. That's why we are trying to work, in some of these global entities that are looking at diagnosis, that are looking at precision medicines. I think we need to be aware of what they're doing, but we can also contribute a great deal to that. So, yes, it is a concern that I think people might look up and say, what am I losing? I think we need to flip it around and say, what do you need? What do you want? What would make it so that it is more valuable for you to be in than it is to be out? If we can answer that, then people are in.
I love it. What a great way to end this. We're at the top of the hour. This is such an incredible topic. It's just such an incredible way to look at the industry in general. What does the future look like? There's so much more. I'm sure we're going to probably speak to you further after the December 16th launch of your new initiative. I think it's incredibly inspiring and has so much impact on so much of what we do in the life sciences and the healthcare space. So congratulations to you, to the team, and everybody involved in this rare disorders. Kudos to you, and obviously salute to all of the patients in this area as well. So I want to thank everybody for your time of being here with us today. For those of you who are interested in contacting Durhane, we are going to leave links to her and her website in our show notes below. Please reach out to her if you're interested in connecting, contacting, partnering. She'll be available. And please check us out at impetusdigital.com. If you were interested in this conversation or other interesting stakeholder discourse over the course of multiple touch points as you're developing protocols, as you're developing consensus, ideas, collaboration, documents, that's what we do at Impetus. We do this through asynchronous and synchronous collaboration, and we help you manage it throughout the process. So if you're interested in doing something with Durhane or with other stakeholders, come and reach out to us as well. Thank you for your time today, everybody. Please like this video or subscribe. It helps us to get content to other people. Thank you so much, Durhane. This was an absolute pleasure speaking with you and wishing everybody a wonderful day ahead.
Thank you.